Welcome everybody to the Fast Start for the worst named camera in the last 50 years, the Olympus OM-D EM-5, and we're going to talk a little bit about exactly why it's called that in a short bit. So this class is going to take you through how to use and set up this camera tailored just the way you want it to work. So here's kind of what we're going to be doing for the next several hours. No, I'm sorry, we cannot describe how to use this camera in a 10-minute YouTube video. We're going to spend some serious time to dive in. We're going to go through all the menu settings. We're going to talk about a little bit of overview, what we've got ourselves into here, because this is a very different camera than your typical Nikons and Canons. We're going to go around and talk about every button on the camera, what each of the buttons is for and how it can be customized and what you might want to use with it. We're going to dive into the display system and go through that. We're going to go through the menu system, and it sounds incredibly tedious, but we're going to go through it line item by line item. We're not going to spend a lot of time in some of them, but we're just going to go through, and I'm going to be giving my recommendations on setups for different people, different types of photography and so forth. And I should mention at this time, if you do buy the class, you do get the PDF, which is a 9-page color outline that I hand out for my in-person classes that I teach outside of Creative Live. And this is a great way to download things and kind of, it's not a full instruction manual by any means, but it's a great way to take notes. But what I like about it is, because I'm a very visual person and I know a lot of photographers are, I've put the entire menu system on one page, as well as my recommendations. And with this camera, I've had to change my recommendations, and I have kind of average recommendations and then for advanced users. And so we'll talk about that when we get to the menu system so that you can kind of get your camera set up. And if you were to set this up, you know that you're not doing anything majorly wrong. You can tweak it from there. It's your own camera. Tweak it any way you want. I'm not saying it's the only way to do it. And then finally, on the final 2 pages of the outline, is recommendations on how to set the camera up with focusing and exposure for different types of situation, whether you're shooting, say, landscape photography, or you're shooting sports or action photography, or different types of things. So if you kind of want to have an idea on how to set things up on the camera, it's a nice little quick tutorial on that. All right, so let's get started with the camera. And it comes with a rather small instruction manual. It's much, much smaller than the ones I've seen with other cameras. And there's a lot of things that are lacking in here. So hopefully we are going to fill in those gaps in this class. But there are things in this class that I'm not going to address that are in the instruction manual. So there is perhaps something that I'm not going to cover, and you may want to check the instruction manual for certain setups and certain exact button sequences in order for something to work. So it is still a valuable resource. Keep it around while you are early on working with this camera. Now, if you haven't been to one of my Fast Start classes, this is not a photography class. This is a class on a camera. So we're not going to go into compositional tips. We're not going to talk a lot about depth of field other than how to set the aperture on the camera. And so if you want to take better pictures, you need knowledge on how to work the camera, which is what we're going to do today, and then you also need basic photography knowledge and skills in whatever aspect that you're working in. And so this is covering one niche of taking better pictures, at least with this particular camera. All right, I want to do a little overview on the camera that we're working on because things are a little bit different here. So if you are new to Olympus, they have been around for quite some time. They started making microscopes way back in the day. Their first camera, don't know why they came up with the name Semi-Olympus as if it's partially Olympus, but it was the Semi-Olympus 1. And the history here may seem like, well, this is redundant, this is stupid, why do we need to talk about the history of Olympus? Well, on this camera it's kind of important because Olympus has a long history of making small cameras. And that's kind of what this camera is known for, is being a small, high-quality camera. And their original pen camera, designed to be as small as a pen, very small, came out in 1959. And they continued with this very small camera philosophy, including their OM series of cameras, which started in 1973. One of the best high-quality 35mm cameras was the OM-4, which came out in 1983. And if you've ever picked up one of these and used one of them, I remember many years ago I was working in a camera shop and we had some used. I picked it up and I looked through the viewfinder, and the viewfinder was notably larger than any Nikon or Canon that I had seen. And if you just pick it up, the viewing experience through the camera was fantastic. Really, really good viewfinders. I remember when they came out with the first really consumer-grade digital camera, it had 0.3 megapixels. It was a 640 by 480, which our cell phones blow away today. In 2003, this is kind of important here, they brought out the 4/3 format and lens system. It's kind of funny because Olympus was this major manufacturer of 35mm gear. I mean, there's a lot of professional National Geographic type photographers using the OM series of equipment. And then when autofocus came around in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, Olympus just kind of like, where'd they go? It's like they fell off the planet. They just couldn't compete with Canon and Nikon. But when digital came around, they came back at it very, very strong. And then so they introduced a whole new system, a whole new lens mount, a whole new sensor system in this 4/3 lens mount. We're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go on. And then they came up with a new system in 2009 called Micro 4/3. And this is the smaller size that we are dealing with here. This is a Micro 4/3. And they had the pen camera, the return of the pen, which kind of reminiscent of their camera back in 1959. And this is another family member of the pen series. And so we need to talk about the 4/3 system because this is different than your typical Nikons and Canons. And so the 4/3 system is a consortium. These different companies actually decided to work together on a common product, a lens mount and a sensor system that they would share between them. Now, some of those companies are more involved in this than others. And it was all based around the 4/3 sensor, which measures 13 by 17 millimeters in size, which is notably smaller than a 35 millimeter piece of film or a full frame sensor as we know it today. Now, it gets its name partly from the aspect ratio. It's a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is like traditional TVs, which is a little boxy if you compare it to the full frame standard 1 by 1.5. And my personal feelings on it is that the 4:3 ratio is very nice for vertical. Very rarely do you shoot a vertical on a Canon or Nikon and want that full length. A lot of times when you're shooting a portrait, for instance, you're cropping it down to 8 by 10, which is very close to that 4:3 ratio. For landscape work, it's a little boxy for me, so I don't like it as much for landscape, but I think it's better for vertical work. And the 4/3 system also has to do with a lens mount. There's a common lens mount between Olympus and Panasonic cameras and lenses. Leica was originally involved, but they really don't have much in the way of products now. But there are some Leica design lenses that you can get that are made by Panasonic that will work back and forth between the Olympus and the Panasonic. But the original cameras that they came out with are these cameras here. These are what's called 4/3 system, not Micro 4/3, just the 4/3 system. And they came out with some pretty interesting products. The basic problem that I had, as with a lot of people, is compared to your Nikons and Canons, they cost the same amount of money, they were the same size, but they didn't take as good a picture because their sensor was half the size. So why am I going to buy a camera that's the same money, same size, and not as good? And these cameras ultimately didn't do very well in the market. And it basically came down to the size. That was the issue that they wanted to address. And these cameras worked off of a traditional SLR system. So a single lens reflex system has light coming in through the lens. It bounces off of a mirror, up to a ground glass, around the prism system, and out the viewfinder. Okay, this is the way 35mm SLRs have worked for many, many years. They've just added a digital sensor. The lens mount to sensor distance is actually pretty large. So what they decided to do is take out the mirror, the prism system, the ground glass, and move the lens mount closer to the sensor. They're able to make the camera smaller, they're able to make the lens smaller, and they're able to make the whole package much, much smaller in size. And this is what they call Micro 4/3. So it's related, but it's different than the 4/3 system. You'll also see it abbreviated sometimes as MFT, Micro 4/3, or you might just see the number 43, which kind of is the shortcut for 4/3. Now, comparing Micro 4/3 and 4/3, it's exactly the same sensor, all right? It's got the same lens mount. So lenses can work back and forth, but there are different lenses. because we are mounting the lens closer to the sensor with the micro Four Thirds. You need an adapter, which of course they sell, so that if you bought a whole bunch of the original lenses and you want to mount those original 4/3 lenses on your micro 4/3 camera, you can do that because that puts the lens back in the right direction. Now, the interesting advantage that you have on a camera like this is that you can buy an adapter to fit all sorts of lenses. If you have an old original OM Olympus lens, you can buy an adapter and put it on this camera. You can put a Leica, a Pentax, a Canon, a Nikon. You can put almost anything on this camera. Now, you may not get all the functions. You're not going to get autofocus, auto exposure. There's a lot of implications of doing this. And the lenses are as big as they've always been. They're not the new smaller lenses. But you can adapt a lot of lenses. And there's been a lot of people who've had a fun time going to camera stores and on eBay and garage sales and Craigslist, finding old lenses that are kind of funky that you can put on this camera. So it's one of the most adaptable cameras out there. And yes, the price variance in these adapters is quite large. I personally haven't been using it just because I think the autofocus system is so fast and so good on this. I really like the autofocus lenses that are available today. Now with Olympus, they have a micro 4/3 family of cameras. And it seems as if they've kind of abandoned the 4/3 system. They haven't introduced a new camera in, I don't know, at least 2 years. And they haven't introduced any new lenses into that system in more than 2 years. And so they're going after this micro 4/3 group because it was able to make the cameras much, much smaller. Now the Pen series cameras came out and they're kind of interesting. You got manual control, you got interchangeable lenses, but you're stuck holding the camera away from your face because they don't have a viewfinder. And part of my definition of a good camera is a camera that has a good viewfinder, because that's a big experience to the photographer. And so I really didn't take them too seriously until this camera came out, because it was their first micro 4/3 camera with a built-in viewfinder. And they call it an OM-D series, and there's only one camera in the line. It's the EM-5, but it's available in silver or black. So I got the black, so this is actually my camera here. I got the black because I like the black cameras. But the fact of the matter is that if you get the silver lenses, if you like some of their prime lenses, I think it looks a lot better in silver. So I actually think the silver is a little better looking, but I like to be a little bit more subdued with my camera, so I like the black version, but they're both good. All right, so what's so cool and what's so great about this camera besides the small size to it? Well, it's got 16 megapixels, which is going to give you very good picture quality. Yes, you can get higher with other cameras, but this is going to be good enough for what most people need to do with this camera. It's got a 1.4 million dot electronic viewfinder, and so it's got a pretty darn good viewfinder, and that's a big experience to the photographer. And I keep harping on the viewfinders on these cameras because I like cameras with good viewfinders. And while it's not perfect, and I would love to see 10 million dots in there, 1.4 million is doing a pretty good job. It's a pretty good user experience. This camera has, and I will say it, the most amazing stabilization system I have seen in any camera or lens out there. In conjunction with one of my favorite lenses we'll talk about over here, I have been able to shoot sharp pictures at 1/2 of a second. I did get a couple at 1 full second that were sharp. But it's amazing how good this stabilization system is. So for anyone who wants to shoot under low light conditions, handheld, it's amazing because you can take old Leica, Olympus lenses, Nikon, Canon lenses, and you can get the stabilization to work on any lens because it's built into the body. So I'm excited about that. You also have a high ISO of 25,000. At that level, it's not very good, but it is very, very clean up through 800. It's still pretty good at 1600. I will be showing you some actual tests of different ISOs as we get into the ISO settings on the camera. And then finally, we can shoot at 9 frames per second. Now, the camera does not have great autofocus, so it's not a great sports camera. But if you do need a fast frame rate for something that's not moving towards you or away from you very quickly, 9 frames per second is very, very high up there in the category of fast shooting cameras. And so those are some of the headlining features of the camera, and we'll get into talking about setting those up in a moment. Now this camera does have some weatherproofing on it. And I always love this. It's waterproof but cannot be used underwater, so do be careful about that. And so specifically what Olympus says is that there are multiple ring-shaped seals to protect the camera from sand, dust, rain, and water spray. They make no claims as to what it will withstand. Torrential rainfall for 20 minutes or a drenching with a hose or a bucket of water. It doesn't specifically say. If you look on the camera, on the lens itself, let's see if I don't know if they can get a shot of this, but around the lens there's a rubber seal on this particular lens, but it's not on most of their lenses, this rubber seal that connects up with the camera body. And the camera body is pretty well weather sealed, and so it's going to do pretty good in the rain. But you have to be careful because if you get another lens, so I'll take another lens here, this lens does not have any rubber seal on it. And so you kind of need a weather sealed body, which you got, and you got to have a weather sealed lens, and there's not very many weather sealed lenses. So you do need to be careful if you're going to be in a very wet environment. All right, so if you're watching at home with the class or you're here, hopefully you have charged the battery. It takes about 4 hours. So it's a little bit longer charge than with some of the other cameras that are on the market. Battery life is not as good on this camera as it is with some of your Nikons and Canons because it has an electronic viewfinder, so you're using a lot more power for visual means to see what's going on. So it might be wise to have an extra battery. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So hopefully you got your lens on, you got your battery installed, you got your memory card, take your lens cap off, go ahead and turn your camera on. It kills me to say this, absolutely kills me, but put your camera in the eye auto mode. Make sure my camera's turned on here. And just go ahead and take a picture. I'm going to go ahead and take a picture in here. Just make sure everyone's camera is working. If not, good time to go throw your battery on the charger while we go through a few other things here. Now for the rest of this class, I'm going to recommend turning your mode dial on the top of your camera to M for manual. That way we can get in and access all the features of the camera.